Coffee is for leaders.
But there is something very interesting that's happening today. In the next 5 years, $30 trillion of capital is going to transfer into the hands of women. What does that mean? If you look at the family offices, the next generations that inherit that, many of them are just happening to be women. And so you think, yay, like hopefully that will change, because the women that are controlling the wealth will demand products and services and technologies that are meaningful for them.
Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the show. You are the founding partner of Muse Capital. You have had an incredible career up to this point, really done some fascinating and really interesting things, which we'll dig into. But tell us how you became the founding partner of Muse Capital.
That is a very long story, but thank you, Clint, for having me.
We have all the time in the world, Rachel.
Like I said, I feel like I've lived 9 lives, so to go through the whole chapter, we'd be here for a long time. But no, thank you for having me. I love your podcast, and you really have got some incredible guests, like guests that I look up to. So thank you again. Okay, so maybe to start, in terms of what we do today. So what is Muse Capital? So Muse Capital is an early stage consumer venture fund that invests in overlooked, untapped companies and entrepreneurs in 3 key sectors: the future of how we care, play, and live. We typically invest where Silicon Valley has not. Massive multi-billion-dollar opportunities that have just traditionally lacked funding. And so what does that mean? So if you look at our care bucket, a very overlooked area within the world of care is women's health. And even though women make up 50% of the global population, our care is very much subpar and could be a lot better. And so for years and years and years, we were just like, why on earth is it that there aren't more companies and solutions that are tackling this very big problem? And so when we dug a little bit deeper, we realized this was a great opportunity that has just historically lacked funding. Other examples of care are the future of elderly care, childcare, and then in our play bucket, it's things like women's sport. Women's sport has been horribly overlooked and underfunded, but is certainly having a moment here in the US. And then our live bucket is things like the future of parenting. Parenting is changing very much from my parents' generation. So what are the companies and solutions that are being built for the modern day parent? And so that kind of gives you an example of the areas that we look at.
So give me a sense for these buckets. You have 3 buckets?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's very cool.
And I think there's for the consumer, at least, we think these 3 areas are undergoing like massive change right now. And we're not new to this. We started this 8 years ago. And 8 years ago, if you went out and said you're investing in women's health, you would be met with very blank faces, because the people that you're pitching to really didn't understand the opportunity there. Thankfully, things have changed now, but there's a lot more work to do. And so even though we've been at this for a long time, I feel like we're just getting started. So, and in terms of how I got to doing this, I think I have one of the most non-linear paths into VC I know. I think both my partner and I do. But honestly, I hope it's inspiring for other people, because I think the idea of becoming a venture capitalist was just not ever like on the table for me. And hopefully it will teach people that you don't necessarily have to have a certain background to succeed in a particular industry. So that non-linear path started, so I'm from the UK originally, grew up there, went to school there, went to university there, graduated and started my career in brand research of all things. And through that, I was able to build relationships with marketing directors of Fortune 500s. Everybody from like Coca-Cola to Aston Martin to Chanel. And that was a very fortuitous internship, really, where I built these relationships. And because of that, after I graduated, the founders of my next company heard that I had all of these relationships and said, hey, would you like to join us? And these were the founders of a company called Quintessentially. And this is a global luxury lifestyle management company. Typically, they look after high net worths. Think of a Richard Branson, for example, in the UK, he would know everyone and everything. But if he traveled to Tokyo, to Rio, to Tel Aviv, we had people on the ground that could look after whatever needs he had. And so they found me, I think I was 23 years old at the time, and said, hey, you know all these brands, we'd like to start the corporate division of our company. So instead of working with high net worth individuals, work with Fortune 500s, their C-level, but also with their top clients. And so I just thought, wow, this is great. I always wanted to travel, and it was a global role. And so, I just started to talk to my prior network about this service and ended up being with them for quite some time, I think 6 years. Got to live and travel all over the world. So I was going to different cities every few months, working with the local teams that could speak the language. And, things like going to Milan and working with the Gucci Group, Armani, Ferrari, and then having the teams locally translate. And I got to do this across 3 continents and built a pretty extraordinary network. And it wasn't just Fortune 500 brands, it was also, celebrities in the music industry, some of the music labels. And funny, my overlap to sport was working with clubs like Chelsea, Man United, Arsenal for their kind of VIPs, and even for their players. And so it was a pretty amazing role to have, in your early 20s. And probably the most famous deal that people would know about is the black Amex card. So the Amex Centurion, we were actually the company that ended up powering the back of that. And so it was a lot of fun. I think in your early 20s, when you have little responsibility, it's a great opportunity, and it's how I built my network. And roll forward, corporate ended up being, a significant part of that company, but I didn't think I was going to be able to go any further. And so ended up leaving. This was 2012, I think. And I found myself in Asia for a little bit, and I was introduced to somebody who changed my life. A guy called Troy Carter. And Troy, back in 2012, was famous for being Lady Gaga's manager. And at the time, she was the biggest pop star in the world. And so I just innocently just sat with him and said, what's exciting to you? And he said, technology and early stage investing. And I was fascinated. I was like, wow, you're a music manager. What do you mean? And he said, look, I've been spending a lot of time in Silicon Valley. And I just invested into this incredible company you should know about called Uber. What's Uber? And more importantly, why are they letting you invest? And he just explained that, he was leveraging his network, and he was the one that got a lot of, the big celebrities into that deal, which was not a bad deal. And he was just one of the original people from kind of Los Angeles who, spotted what was happening in Silicon Valley, and really became this catalyst between culture and technology. And he didn't just invest in Uber, he was in Warby Parker, Dropbox, Snap, Spotify, one of the most successful super angels, and an incredible guy. And it was like in that moment that my mind was just blown. And I remember sitting with Troy and saying, hey, I have a pretty big network, how do I get into this space? And he's like, Rachel, you should. There's very few people like us in Silicon Valley who don't just have the relationships, but the business knowledge to get this done. And so in that life-changing moment, I remember coming back to the UK, speaking to friends that work with startups, venture capital firms, and saying, how does this all work? And inspired, I ended up moving to New York. So this was 2013. And I decided to start a consultancy that was essentially working with early stage technology companies, but then leveraging my old network to help these companies grow. So a partnership with a Fortune 500, a partnership with a celebrity. And I would do that for sweat equity and consultancy. And that was literally my pivot into tech. And after doing that, this was a time when music streaming was just coming into North America. So Spotify was launching in North America, Apple Music was launching, SoundCloud was kind of the biggest thing, if you remember that time. And I had a client that was in the audio recognition space, and I ended up helping them do their deals with the labels, their deals with all the big DJs of the time. So I think Avicii, Calvin Harris, etc., to get them to, adapt the platform. And then most importantly, integrating that technology into the big streaming services. And actually the woman that I met to do the deal with for Spotify is Asia, who is my now partner in Muse Capital. And so we actually met on a business development M&A deal. And I remember meeting her, and you have so many business meetings in your life, but meeting her, I was like, oh wow, she's cool and has a more fascinating background. And we ended up actually working against each other on the deal for a year.
That's awesome.
So you get to know someone extremely well. And we ended up doing the deal. And after that, we just said, okay, at this point in our careers, we have made a lot of money for a lot of other people, mostly men. And we just thought, what's our legacy? What do we want to build? Clearly, we have some very unique skill sets that would be very valuable to entrepreneurs. And so, 8 years ago now, Muse Capital was born. And it kind of happened. We just decided to join forces on the consultancy and start writing angel checks behind the kind of consulting work that we were doing, and had some success pretty early, which doesn't happen in VC. And so we thought, hey, we should just be doing this full time. And the original idea for Muse Capital was, let's be really helpful on the cap table. We have a background and a history where we're helping startups get their very first revenue generating distribution partnerships, which is so hard to do when nobody knows who you are. Yet we'd been doing this for a really long time. And so we just thought, hey, let's do it. And as we were building it, my partner actually ended up getting diagnosed with breast cancer. And it was a shock. And I remember coming back from Europe, she had to go through a whole double mastectomy, which, if you know anything about this, is a 6-month process. And she ended up kind of stopping what she was doing. I ended up moving in with her, and we just developed this extraordinary kind of friendship, but also that whole experience gave us this time to really think about what we wanted to build. And actually going through that experience as two, I say, elder millennial technologists, right? We just said, why is it that we have Uber, Instacart, etc., yet we don't have services like this in something as important as healthcare? And more importantly, what's going on with women's health? Because it feels like there's a really missed opportunity here. And so after doing some research through that process, we were like, wow, this is a really big opportunity. And so that experience, terrible as it was, actually informed our future. And our thesis was, where are these markets that are overlooked? And so we ended up, she fully recovered, by the way. And we started our first funds. We raised our first fund, I think, end of 2018. And we just started to put our thesis to work. And like I said earlier, going out there and telling investors that we were going to be investing in areas like women's health and elderly care and childcare, we were honestly laughed out of rooms. I think one of the funniest interactions I ever had was with an LP who invests in funds, who said, you're investing in women's health and things like menopause. And he said, isn't that a niche? And we were like, wait, it's half the population. It's definitely not a niche. And luckily, like back then, we were like one of the first investors in a company now called MIDI. And MIDI is probably one of the fastest growing women's health companies in the country today. We ended up leading their pre-seed, and they just raised it close to $500 million like a few years later. And so we're like, that's not really niche. And
that's not niche at all.
Yeah, so that's kind of how it all happened. And we started that first fund, raised the second fund, probably in the two worst climates ever to raise. The first was COVID. The second was the biggest market downturn, investing in these horribly overlooked areas. It wasn't for the faint of heart, is what I would say. But here we are.
No, it's incredible. And thank you for giving us that story and your background, because I just find it so fascinating. I want to ask you, like, all the stats that I've looked at in terms of venture capital goes to women is around like 1% to 2%, if I'm not mistaken. Like, and the rest is just goes to men. This is venture capital dollars invested into companies led by either men or women. About 99% goes to men, 1% goes to women. And so I want to ask you about that, but also on top of that, what I find fascinating what you're doing is I don't know a lot of women-led VC funds either. I wonder what the stats are there. And I wonder if there's any correlation between the fact that most VC funds are run by men, which means most men get VCs or get VC funded versus women. Give me your sense of that with those two stats. And again, I could be totally wrong about what they are, but last time I looked, it was like 1% or 2%.
I wish you were wrong. You're not. You're bang on. I think the actual stat is 2% of all venture capital dollars globally goes into female or minority founders. It's and that stat is pretty well known. But I think what's really fascinating is the reasons why. And so if you go a little bit deeper, in order to be an entrepreneur, you need to raise VC dollars, right? It's in the tech world. And if you think about it, as a female entrepreneur, who are you pitching to? You're typically pitching, and there's some stats. So in venture capital, I think 15% of women work in venture capital, but of those women, probably about not even 1% have check writing ability, meaning that you might get conviction on a female founder, what they're building, but then you then have to go and present to your all male IC that this is a company that you should be investing in. And that's tough. Certainly if you're working in like areas like ours, where really the people that you're pitching to really don't have that personal experience. It's, like, let me ask my wife, let me ask my daughter, which is extremely frustrating. And so if you think about that, it's like, where is the money coming from? The entrepreneur needs to pitch to more women that have check writing ability. And today that's at 1%. So 1-2%. And so this whole thing kind of falls apart. Now take it a layer deeper. Who funds the VCs? LPs, family offices, institutions. What do you think the stats are up there? Pretty bad. And listen, we have experienced this firsthand. When you are going out as an all-female team that's trying to raise capital from LPs, so they're called limited partners, they're the ones that will invest in your fund, that then will invest in your thesis. I get the feedback that I told you about. It's like, these areas look so niche. I don't really understand them. And so the whole system breaks. So if you go even deeper and look at the LPs, so the LPs are the investors that invest into the venture capital funds. I mean, the stats are not good there either, just in terms of, who's controlling family offices, endowments, institutions, pension funds. But there is something very interesting that's happening today. In the next 5 years, $30 trillion of capital is going to transfer into the hands of women. What does that mean? If you look at the family offices, the next generations that inherit that, many of them are just happening to be women. And so you think, yay, like hopefully that will change, because the women that are controlling the wealth, will demand products and services and technologies that are meaningful for them. But there's a problem, and that is the education, because typically in the family office structure, and this isn't everywhere, but in many places in the world, it's the dad and the brother that are controlling the family businesses. So when suddenly it's the daughter, sometimes, they have the education and knowledge on what to do with that, but most of the times not. And, there's a lot of philanthropic capital that gets deployed, but it's teaching these women in family offices that you can invest in for-profit companies that are also having the kind of impact that you care about. And so that's just a little bit more information on what's actually going on behind that 2% of women stat. And that's why.
Tell us what Muse is focusing on over the next 10 years, given all of the reality that you just gave us.
Well, the most important thing is, in order for that whole system to change, so you have all that information on that 2%, but not typically the deeper meaning behind it or the reasons behind. For us, the only way this is going to change is if people like us are successful, right? We have to show that you can invest into these horribly overlooked, underfunded sectors and make a lot of money. And so over the last 8 years, we have been very, very focused on not telling our story, just, really rolling our sleeves up and helping those entrepreneurs get the metrics that they need to succeed. And so we're hyper focused on that. And as I'm sure venture capital takes time. We're 8 years into our journey, 2 funds. It's only about now that all of these results are really starting to come in, and that's extremely exciting for us. So that's the most important thing. And in terms of what we're excited about, I mean, given all the advances in technology and AI that's thrown around a lot, we're super excited because we think about what are the use cases of AI that apply to our thesis, right? How can we make women's lives better with artificial intelligence? How can we make parents' lives better? Again, areas where it's not really thought about in Silicon Valley. And so we think that's a huge opportunity. And we're seeing some amazing companies that are, going for it. So
given everybody you've invested in and just, the incredible network you have, what's kind of like a commonality of you've seen in traits or whatever, however you'd put it, in terms of what a great leader is? Maybe even like what makes a great entrepreneur? What makes a great leader?
So interesting. I think a few things. I think the best entrepreneurs that we have are the ones that have the most grit, like the ones who are determined at all costs, no matter what, the markets, etc., throws at them, to be able to survive and thrive. And not everybody's built that way. And, really looking for that ability to just keep going no matter what the circumstances is something, because we invest so early, that we really look at, because everybody can have an idea. It's like when we do our due diligence, it's like, what have you actually done? Can you execute? And there's a lot of very smart people out there, but in terms of actually, rolling their sleeves up and, doing the work, it's a lot less. And so I think the ability to execute, and then the ability to have the self-awareness that you alone cannot do everything, and that you need to identify your strengths and then hire the team that can plug those weaknesses. I get red flags when I hear an entrepreneur that thinks they can do everything, right? It's like, you can't. You need to build that team that can step in. And honestly, you shouldn't be doing that, because you need to be focusing on other things. Grit, the ability to hire, and just a really clear vision and mission. Those are the things we look for in entrepreneurs. And then a step away from the entrepreneur is 3 things we look at: team, timing, TAM. Because if you don't have all those 3 things lined up, you could have a great team building something at the wrong time, right? It's a very interesting thing right now with AI. Or you can have, a huge TAM, but the wrong team. That's never going to work. So I think the stars have to align there, and that's
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. Finally, we end every interview with the same question, and that is at CEO.com. We believe the chances one gives is just as important as the chances one takes. When you hear that, who gave you a chance to get you to where you are today?
So the first people to talk about is my parents. I'm sure everybody says that, but I have an immigrant mother, immigrant mentality. Make the most of the opportunities you have today because you literally have family members who would kill for what you do. And then people like Troy, who came in and kind of opened my eyes. Troy is an amazing human being and super humble at the same time. And then my business partner, Asia, we took a chance on each other. I think we saw something very special in each other and we knew that we were very complementary. And by the way, that's the hardest thing to find, like in a co-founding team. Like most partnerships and startups fail because of that dynamic. And given kind of what we've been through, both personally and professionally over the last like decade or so, we feel like we're bulletproof at this point. It's like throw anything at us, personal, professional. We've figured it out. So, I mean, to her for taking the chance.
Rachel, thank you so much for coming on. Seriously, what an honor.
Oh, no, thank you for having me. And I hope it was useful, interesting, inspiring.
It was all those things. Thanks so much.